I'm going to start off with a story, and you'll notice that storytelling is very important for the research that we've done. Just to explain a little bit of the background of the story, there was a young Lebanese Muslim woman. She wears a hijab. She's doing her doctoral training as a therapist, and she was on placement. And part of her training was to find a therapist herself. So she found someone, and that person was wonderful. After about a year of being in a very deep relationship with this therapist, the therapist looks at her and says, "You know what? I'm actually kind of surprised you came to me in the first place." And the Lebanese woman said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, because I'm Jewish." We can pause here for a second, right? Think about the process of racialization, what was assumed of this Arab Muslim woman, what was assumed of her relationship to Jews. She didn't know she was Jewish. I'm going to unpause. We're going to talk a lot about this anyway. She was like, "I don't care, right? Let's just go on. We've had a fantastic relationship." So they maintain their therapeutic relationship, and then October 7th happens. And this is where that story begins that you see on the screen. I then told her I'm feeling depressed about all of this, especially how the media was framing everything. Who gets framed as terrorists? I was treading very carefully not to say something about Hamas. And then she said, "Well, Israel had every right to defend itself, and it may be disproportionate in the future. But I just have to tell you, as my duty, if you support Hamas, that means you're spreading terror, and I won't be able to work with you." So yeah, I swear to you, it felt like my body was on fire. In that moment, "You're spreading terror," for her to say that? What was she implying? She fit the narrative that everyone's going around saying Hezbollah, Hamas, and all of these terrorist organizations. So yeah, I felt so stressed, I started shaking. And then in the middle of the session, I blacked out. She continued for the rest of the session, talking about relationships. And I think I disassociated. I don't know where I went. Then I walked out hysterically, crying on the streets. She never knew what was going on when I disassociated. It happened internally. I couldn't voice it to her anymore. It was like she suffocated me in that moment. This is a very violent encounter. And the violence of it perhaps can't be underlined or stressed enough, given that they were in a relationship already for almost a year and a half at that point. So this is the sort of violence that we are going to hold on to in our hearts as we move forward through the purpose of this research project, as well as the presentation for today. The agenda for today is that I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit more formally, and then we're going to have two fantastic speakers who've had incredible experiences of being repressed for their Palestinian solidarity in mental health care. We'll take a short break then, and then we'll return and really unpack what is going on in those instances like the one I just introduced in the beginning. And the three main themes is that British mental health care is political, it's racist, and it's not safe. And then we'll follow that up with a discussion and a Q&A. I, like many of you, wake up in the morning and we read the news of what's going on. And there's the violence of an incredibly atrocious man-made famine that we're seeing in Gaza today. And I was reminded of a very powerful essay that was written not too long ago by a Gazan writer, Hossein Ma'ruf. Look it up. The essay is called Hunger That Defeats Language. He's a writer, and he talks about how difficult it is to write on an empty stomach. And I say that to start with the blessings and privilege that I recognize that I'm only able to speak to you right now because I've been privileged and blessed to be able to eat before coming. And I think it's important for us to take that moment and renew our intentions, all of us collectively, what we're engaging in when we are listening online, when you're sitting with me here in this room. What are we doing this for? It's very easy for you as an audience. We enter into this extractive relationship. You're listening to me give you knowledge. You're just trying to extract it and we walk away. Rather, I want us to start reflecting, what am I committing myself to with all this violence that I'm bearing witness to, right? Renew your commitment to the liberation of Palestinians and the land of Palestine. This is something that's incredibly significant. We don't want to have an extractive relationship here between us. The overall aim of the project that we've been conducting for about a year and a half was to document and explore the experiences of those who've been silenced, disciplined, or managed for their Palestinian solidarity in British mental health care. Now, that's what it says on the tin. To be very clear, there's a lot of other sort of guiding questions that come out, which is, how the hell can British mental health care be allowing so much incredible racism to be legitimized in its institutions? That's an underlying question I'd like you to just kind of hold on to, starting off with that story that we started with. And to make sense of it, this isn't a class, okay? If you've ever been to my classes, they can last a while.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to keep theory relatively short, okay? But I feel like one of the issues we have, and I've been teaching on racism in mental health care and racism in liberal politics for many, many years. And one of the central issues is that we just assume everybody has the same position of racism, anti-racism, their understanding of where racism comes from. So I'm going to explain to you my position. And that position begins with Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, who made the distinction between wolves and foxes. If you heard me speak before, you know I've spoken about wolves and foxes. I've spoken about it so much, someone here made a cute little, you could see it right there. You see those cute little wolves and foxes right there? The only problem with that picture is that wolf in the picture is supposed to look much, much angrier. When Malcolm X was talking about wolves and foxes, I got some happy audience in the front. Yeah, this is for the kids. When Malcolm X was talking about wolves and foxes, he was making the distinction between the wolf, the animal that looks so vicious when it's about to attack you, right? It's growling, it's snarling, you can see it, it's showing its teeth, it wants to take a bite out of you. The wolf is the illiberal racist, the sort of racist that all of us in the room and everyone watching can all agree that's a racist. And it's often, when we think about illiberal racism, we're thinking about racists that make wholesale demonization of entire groups. So they say, I hate all Muslims, I hate all black people, etc., right? A wholesale demonization. The sort of racism that's not acceptable in liberal society. Malcolm X wasn't trying to talk about wolves in this talk. He was talking about foxes. The fox is smiling, it's conniving, it looks as cute as it does in this picture. It invites you in, it befriends you. It gives you therapy for a year and a half. But eventually it bites you anyway. You see, what Malcolm X is saying is that the form and function of what the wolf and the fox want in the end are one and the same. Liberal racism is the central subject here that we're going to be talking about. To begin, I think, yes. You'll also hear me talk about racialization. So when I say racialized Muslims, racialized black folks, when I say racialized Jews, I'm talking about a process of racialization that understands that you cannot make sense of racism without politics, okay? Anyone who is talking to you about racism without politics, I'm going to straight up say is a charlatan. Okay? You cannot understand how racism operates without politics, because we are racialized according to time and space. We are racialized according to contexts, right? Which is why, for example, an Egyptian Coptic Christian, if you don't know what an Egyptian Coptic Christian looks like, you can maybe look at me. I'm Egyptian, I'm not Coptic Christian. But Egyptian Coptic Christians get attacked on the street for being racialized as a Muslim. You understand? So it's actually irrelevant how they identify themselves. It's the fact that they get racialized as a Muslim, which speaks to what? Not their identity, but the context that they're in. This is really, really important, and that's how Stuart Hall thinks of race as a floating signifier. This is essential for us to understand the racism that's happening in mental health care. Now, of course, with liberal racism, with Foxes, we're talking about not the wholesale demonization of groups, but the way often the language of it is, oh, not all Muslims are bad, it's just some of them are bad, right? Not all Black people, some of them. Not all immigrants. Yeah, there's of course some good immigrants. Most of them can be leeches on society. That's the sort of liberal racism that's acceptable. And it works on these registers of good and bad. And that register showed up in that story, right? There was a register that took that Lebanese woman from the good to the bad. Now, obviously, liberal racism then obviously informs all the issues with liberal anti-racism. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but Sadr Ahmed talks about how anti-racism in liberal discourse is often just a thinking of an issue of just knowledge and awareness. Oh, if we all got to know each other better, we wouldn't be racists anymore. But what is it displacing? What have I spoken about so far? It's politics that informs racism. This is really, really important, especially, for example, when we think about the violence that's showing up in EDI spaces and others. Now, I'm going to make a point. I'm going to go ahead and jump to something that I think is very important today, with a lot of discussions around definitions. And if anyone who knows me, I've worked publicly around discussions around Islamophobia, et cetera. I just really need to emphasize a very important point. You never, ever let your oppressor define your oppression. A child living constantly under the suffocating sounds of drones knows very well the form and function of a drone much better than the people who made it. A Muslim political prisoner here in the UK knows and understands Islamophobia much better than a Muslim discussing it in parliament. And for that very logic, it's the same thing with Palestinians who understand the form and function of Zionism and the way it has impacted them for decades, that we can absolutely not deny. So we will be talking about Zionism today. And I will begin with a definition that this is just from one writer. And to be honest, if you take Ilan Pape, you take all the different definitions proposed to Zionism, they all kind of revolve around the same meaning. This is from Muhammad al-Qudus' book, Perfect Victims. He says, Zionism, the political ideology born in 19th century Central and Eastern Europe, that argued that the creation of a Jewish state would be the only viable solution to the persecution of Jews, is an ideology of dispossession, an expansionist and racist settler colonial enterprise. Okay. There's some key features here that we need to understand to make sense of the violence that began and the violence we're about to see. And it's key features of racism that I'm highlighting. One, that it's an extension of European colonialism, okay, which centers whiteness. This is very, very important. Two, the any, as Imi Césaire talks about, the functional relationship of colonization is between a dominator and a dominated, okay? In a settler colonial context, that's of a racial domination that's also marked by erasure, because that is the purpose of a settler colonial project itself. And it's important to mention that the vast majority of the world, such as what we've seen in the 1975 UN Resolution 3379, agreed that Zionism itself is racism, that when we see the apartheid in Israel, it is not an aberration, but rather it's a form and function of the Zionist project itself. Therefore, Zionism is racism. This UN resolution, by the way, wasn't repealed because we theoretically had a different understanding of what Zionism is. It was repealed at the request of Israel to enter into the shambolic Oslo peace process. What I'm marking here, this is really important, is the racism. I'm marking here racism, okay? There's three distinct elements here that's going to be really important for us to understand the violence that's happening in liberal settings such as mental health. One is that often the focus is on the erasure happening over there, but actually the erasure is global, and the impact of Palestinian erasure is also global, right? This is really, really significant insofar as we're seeing the way we're seeing it right now, obviously how Palestinian solidarity is being silenced and managed and disciplined across the global north, okay? Two, and this is something that's really understated, but actually well recognized among scholars of Islamophobia, is that there's a deep relationship between Zionism and Islamophobia, which really hasn't been articulated enough, but it's particularly salient in the war on terror. And Israel has long established itself foundationally at this point almost as a proponent of the war on terror. And this also speaks to the securitization of Muslims here in the UK. And of course, the deep relationship between Zionism and Western imperialism, whereby Zionism has long positioned itself as the vanguard of European civilization from the forces coming of the Arab and Muslim lands. Okay. I'm setting this because unless we understand a little bit of the theory, and I'm sure if anyone wanted more recommendations of books, I'm happy to give that to you. But you can't understand narratives without some backgrounds. Now, I promise myself I won't say any statistics. And I still don't really intend to. That might be very difficult to read. It just because it showed up like a couple of weeks ago, I'm like, I'll just throw it in. There's something about erasure that's institutional that you can recognize. And I think most people here can also recognize as a very related issue, which is the widespread appearance of complaints happening, right? People are being complained. We're going to be hearing stories as well. And I just wanted to point at the statistic that the GMC recently published between October 2023 and May 2025. There were over 467 allegations of anti-Semitism. In the same period, there were only 92 allegations of Islamophobia. And this widespread increase is something we're seeing across bodies. So there's a process also that we can recognize if we were to zoom out from a sociological point of view as to what's happening. I am not going to focus on that. So let me tell you a little bit about our research. You know the background now. For us at Healing Justice London, our research is, first and foremost, is community and movement driven. It's to those who are mobilizing on those who are most marginalized. It's led by those who are most impacted to build towards transformative, life-affirming health infrastructures that privileges the honor and dignity of all people. When we set out to do this project, I'm going to take just a moment to say that we took the ethics around this project very seriously. And this is just a point of just to explain how seriously we take this sort of work. For us, this project did go through university ethics. It has university ethics approval from Middlesex University, but that is minuscule. It's couched within our wider understanding of community ethics, our commitment and accountability to the communities we work with. And there's a very lengthy process that we went through, besides developing the project internally, working with people who research this subject, working with people who are deeply impacted by this subject, redeveloping our project, rethinking about what needs to be done, and also, concerns of vulnerabilities, etc. The only thing you need to see is that the university ethics procedure is all the way at the bottom for us. Because for us, ethics is not a checkboxing exercise. We take our commitment to the accountability of communities very seriously. I'm going to kind of go over the research methodology fairly quickly, okay? You'll see it in the report when it comes out. Just a few points that might be relevant for the purpose of the presentation. One, our research stance was explicitly anti-racist, that theoretically and politically informed. We're also taking our research stance as grounded in the institutional violence. So we're speaking to the fact that I'm not sitting outside a process or structure of institutional violence. And here, actually, we're thinking about ethics. There's actually a point, and I don't know if my colleagues are going to be happy that I'm going to start talking about HAL ethics without running this by them. But I just had a thought recently. But I think this is important for the process of presentation, because I've been thinking about how comfortable I am talking to you all, talking online, talking about these topics, right? And there's something about, for us, for research, when we think about our commitment and accountability to communities, there's an Islamic principle in partnerships that a partnership is defined by shared risk, right? We share in the risk, and therefore that's what marks an ethical partnership between two people. And I just wanted to share out loud and say explicitly, in terms of my positionality, I share in the risk as well, right? The participants who feared speaking out, for example, on Palestine, I have that fear. The anxiety, how do we think about, how do we manage ourselves, etc., I share that too. I'm just sharing that positionality. And it's clearly very inspired by narratives, which I've spoken about, inspired by books like We Are Not Numbers, written by Palestinians. And I can talk about the significance of narratives much more, but we don't want to make this a statistical point. I spoke with over 30 mental health professionals and students. Over 20 of them were racialized Muslims. We recruited them online. The interviews lasted between 1 and 2 hours. They were paid, obviously, for their time. We supported them both before and after, offering aftercare menu, but also continuous follow-up. And we did a thematic analysis overall of the topic. I'm going to pause this now to hear two of our wonderful speakers.
My name is Misa, and I'm a clinical nurse specialist, and this is Zara. Zara is a family therapist, and we both I still work in Kensington and Chelsea CAMS, but at the time, last year, we were both there. So I'm going to talk about what happened to us, and Zara is going to say a little bit more about the impact and how we experienced it. But so I'll just talk about, and then I'll sum up by talking about how we continued to resist in the workplace. So last May, I set up a Free Palestine work WhatsApp group and went into work and kind of got a sense of who would want to join the group. Started adding people to the group. Got quite a lot of support. Surprisingly, I had a bit of a buzz, and and in the interest of transparency and particularly for Zara as a family therapist, she was telling me, it's really important to be transparent, and I also understood. We wanted to tell two of our colleagues who were Jewish and had family in Israel. So we told one of our colleagues, we want to just be open and say, look, we want to do something for Palestine, potentially like some kind of protest, like a lunchtime thing. We'd seen other places do it. And we told our colleague, but unfortunately they were a Zionist, and they immediately complained and went to management and complained about us and said that that they didn't feel safe. So the next day, a team email went round from management for our whole team. Sorry to slow down. I've been told to slow down. Apologies. I know Tarek is very nice and slow. I'm not slow. A team email went round, and it was told that they'd heard about that there was going to be a protest, and to remind everybody that this is uncompassionate and against our trust values, and that you could be kind of going against policy, and that it would could be going against your contract. So it was an incredibly abrasive email immediately. So we were then the following week we were invited to reflective practice spaces that were supposedly safe spaces, and we were told that our views were important and that it was good to kind of express them. The space was titled "The Events of the Previous Week," which was odd. But we then we kind of in that reflective space, we talked about Palestine and Israel, and we said that we think it's important to say that it's a genocide. And the ICJ had already called it a genocide at that point. So we wanted to talk about definitions. But we later found out, because of a Freedom for Information request, that they were already investigating us at this point, and they used what we had said in this reflective practice space against us in the interview. So that week, I went in on the Friday, and the first thing in the morning, I was called into a management office, and management said to me, "You're being investigated for gross misconduct, for putting the trust into disrepute, for conspiring to organise a protest that would make other people feel safe about their religion." And the following then happened to Zara on her next working day on the Monday. So the investigation lasted for 3 months. We were redeployed. I was told to leave the building that day to pack my stuff up, even though I had patients to see that day. 13 of our colleagues were interviewed in this process, and all 13 were asked if we were safe to work with Jewish children. I was asked if I felt I was safe to work with Jewish children. The investigation found there was no case to answer for, because they couldn't even prove that we had tried to do a protest, because we hadn't even got to that stage at all. We then went back to I went back to work in September. Zara had already left by that time. Prior to the investigation, already had another job in the pipeline. So I went back by myself in September. But in that process, we'd also completed an internal grievance, which was partially upheld. They upheld the part about our breaking policies, but not the part that they discriminated against us for anti-Zionist beliefs. But I can talk about that a little bit later. So we went to The Guardian. We had a wonderful journalist who we really trusted with our story, and she wrote about what had happened to us. And then, I continued to face harassment for a badge that I was a Freedom for Palestine badge that I wore on my coat, that, no patients weren't seeing. It was just a coat that I was wearing in and out of the building. And they said the same Zionist complained. And I was told eventually, even though I fought it for 6 months through my union, that if I didn't remove it, I would face disciplinary action again. So we decided to take legal action. And so for discrimination against our anti-Zionist beliefs and Islamophobia. And our preliminary hearing is next month. So I'll pass on to Zara.
Hi, everyone. So I want to start by telling you about some of the conversations that I was having in therapy with young people and families that I was working with following October 7th and the start of Israel's genocidal attacks on Gaza. So I worked with a young Muslim boy of Arab background, a teenager, and he told me about how he had to remove his Palestine badge in school, the anger that he felt about this, but also he felt that he couldn't resist it because he would be punished further, and that the school were racist. I also spoke with a family who were also of Muslim background, whose teenage daughter was becoming active in the Palestine solidarity movement. And we thought about their worries about her. They thought she was very vulnerable. She wore a hijab. They were worried about her being attacked. But also there were lots of feelings of pride within the family about her kind of awakening political resistance and activism. And what followed was a conversation about political activism and resistance intergenerationally in their family. I also worked with a white family whose teenage daughter had converted to Islam partly because of solidarity with Palestine. In none of these situations did I respond with neutrality. I took a clear position against the genocide, validating the anger and distress being expressed by my clients as totally legitimate in the face of injustice. I supported them to explore their responses and the positions of the institutions that they found themselves in, and to make meaning of what was happening both outside in the world and then inside of them and in their relationships. I've never questioned whether this response was therapeutically appropriate because it felt completely right within the therapy. As a family therapist, the therapy I offer always considers people's relationships to their wider contexts. My training tells me both that I can understand and hold multiple perspectives on experiences that may be contradictory and even polarized, but that ethically, when there is an abuse of power, we can't be silent, we have to take a position. To be neutral about a genocide and then to locate distress about this inside an individual makes no sense and is not therapeutic. Whilst this approach felt totally right within my work, I knew that starting conversations within my team about showing solidarity to the people of Gaza would be really sensitive, especially as I worked alongside Jewish colleagues who had family in Israel. But as the brutal violence escalated in Gaza and children and healthcare workers were being targeted, the silence for me was becoming ethically intolerable, especially as it was being talked about so much by my patient. Our team, like most other teams in the NHS, presents itself as being totally committed to anti-racism. Talking about politics had never been off the table. We spoke often about party politics, our frustration with the Tory government and policies of austerity. We spoke about the war in Ukraine and Black Lives Matter. All of it was really relevant to our clinical work. But I saw how the issue of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza was different. There was a silence around it. It posed a challenge for my otherwise liberally minded colleagues who might typically impose imperialism and human rights abuses, but found themselves cautious, perhaps in critiquing Israel due to fears of being accused of anti-Semitism or the pervasive influence of discourse that frames Palestinians as terrorists. Despite all this, in my mind, I thought as a team of psychotherapists whose job is talking about difficult things and tolerating painful and conflicting emotions, that we could find a way through. And whilst there might be conflicting views, we would not lose sight of each other's humanity and that we would be able to have dialogue. Thinking about how to have this conversation, my highest context was to be sensitive and make space for the feelings of my Jewish colleagues. I believed that by centering their experiences and their fears, that space for grief about the horrors taking place in Gaza perpetrated by the Israeli government would follow. I didn't ever predict that I would be punished for my attempt at this conversation. What actually happened, what Misa described, her and I being redeployed for over 3 months and framed as a security threat, exposes the superficiality and performative nature of the team's anti-racist values and uncovered the real racial hierarchy behind it. In the team-wide email, our senior management framed showing solidarity with Palestine as conflicting with trust values of compassion and respect. Although not stated, the implication is clear that there is a hierarchy of whose suffering matters and that showing solidarity to Palestine is offensive or somehow anti-Semitic. The speed and severity of our treatment, which a senior member of the trust told me off the record was unheard of in her 20-year tenure, can be contrasted with the sluggishness and lack of conviction in the management response to multiple claims of anti-Black racism that had happened in our service, in which one case took a month for even an acknowledgement from the management team. Looking back on it now, after just over a year, I feel silly for how naive I was. I was a senior member of the team. I was well liked. I worked really hard. I felt respected by my colleagues. And I felt that my religious and racial heritage as a Pakistani Muslim would not affect how I was treated. I felt protected and safe in the institution because I was a good worker and I was always willing to go the extra mile. And I thought by my authentic expression of care and concern for my Jewish colleagues that I could not be accused of anti-Semitism. But actually, when it came down to it, none of that meant anything. I was not given the benefit of the doubt. We weren't given an opportunity to offer our version of events. We weren't allowed to defend ourselves, and the words of our junior white Jewish colleagues were taken as the only truth. During the period while we were investigated, the same Israeli colleague who complained about me told another staff member in the clinic that the murder of Palestinian children by the IDF was the fault of Hamas. This brazen disregard for human life received no punishment. The imbalance is clear. We were redeployed and investigated for 3 months from starting a conversation from a stance of care, concern, and understanding. whereas a blatant statement devaluing Palestinian children's lives received no punishment. It mirrors what is happening to the people of Gaza, occupied, brutally maimed, murdered, starved, and genocided, but then framed as if they are the existential threat to Israelis. I went through a range of emotions from the initiation of the disciplinary process. Immediately after it happened, I found myself in a state of shock and confusion. We knew that a serious complaint had been made against us, that we were being investigated under bullying and harassment policy and accused of gross misconduct and banned from entering the work premises, but not who had made the complaint or what the complaint was. The extreme nature of these words, gross misconduct, threat to personal safety, serious complaint, the physical action of not being allowed in our workplace, and the potential consequences made me feel guilty and ashamed. And I found myself day after day going over every conversation I had or message I had sent to everyone in my team, trying to locate what it was that I had done wrong. I can see now, looking back on it, that it was somehow easier psychologically at that time for me to think that I had done something wrong than to really take in the flagrant corruption of the institution. I think this was also exacerbated by my union rep, who, wanting to get me out of the situation with the minimum penalty, was advising me that I needed to show remorse and take responsibility rather than challenging the institutional response. It took me a really long time to feel confident that I was not in the wrong and put the blame fully back onto the organisation. It was probably only until the investigation was concluded with no case to answer, and I received that in writing, that I fully felt able to throw off my own sense of guilt and shame. The initial plan that the management team had come up with was to redeploy us to another clinic on the outskirts of London, far from my base with my patients and my home. When I challenged this because of my caring responsibilities to my 2 young children, they told me they weren't aware that I had children. Eventually, after negotiation from my union, it was agreed that I could work from home and in a closer location, but it was hard not to see their original plan as an act of intimidation and punishment.
Yes.
My immediate line managers and supervisors were not informed of any of the details of the investigation. We were told by our service manager that this was a decision made at the director level. Yet these directors stonewalled us, ignoring our emails and calls as if we were a silly nuisance. The service manager then became the spokesperson, but gave us confusing mixed messages, reassuring us that she was on our side, that she disagreed with the executive, but also that what we had done was very serious and it was right that we shouldn't be on the premises. So we were left with this horrible feeling of being punished by a faceless group of people who did not know us. I felt like the executive team were emboldened by political discourse at the time. For example, Suella Braverman talking about Palestine solidarity marches being hate marches, and Wes Streeting talking about rooting out anti-Semitism in the NHS and then conflating anti-Semitism with support for Palestine. It began to feel like we were up against a powerful ideology, and what had actually happened, who we were, and what we believed didn't matter. I also felt during this time extremely paranoid. We were not told who had made the complaint against us and were silenced from talking about it within our team. So I felt like I couldn't trust my colleagues. I kept on wondering, who was it who has reported me? Who was it who thinks that I'm threatening and dangerous? In my personal therapy with my white therapist, who I've seen for many years, I also became mistrustful. I started to think that she was going to report me, that she might think that I was anti-Semitic. And although I eventually shared my concerns with her and she reassured me, I felt silenced and watched within that space for a long time as well. I worried about a prevent referral and being struck off the register. And although none of these things actually happened, the extreme vulnerability of our position and the lack of control was completely destabilizing. Just briefly, before I pass back to Misa, who's going to talk a little bit more about resistance, I want to mention the people who helped us get through this terrifying experience and resist being silenced. While the institution treated us so badly, we were overwhelmed with people who offered us their support, love, and care during this time. So many people who didn't even know us were generous with their time and advice. My family and friends supported me and never questioned what I did. My dad's immediate response when I told him what had happened was that where he is from in Pakistan, people get jailed and killed for speaking out, and what I was experiencing was nothing. While while this was quite a brutal comment at the time, I think it's actually really helpful to put our material situation into perspective, that we were still being paid, that we were safe, that we had food to eat, that we had our jobs, and actually compared to the plight of the people in Gaza and lots of people speaking out around the world, what was happening to us was relatively smaller in comparison. I also just wanted to shout out my group that I'm a part of, Family Therapists for Palestine. At the moment, within our profession, our professional body is refusing to take a position on the genocide, despite our values, and it feels quite a shameful time to be a family therapist. But this group gives me hope, and when I'm with them, I feel that I have strength to continue to resist.
Thanks, Zara. That was sweet. I actually don't get used to hearing it back. I'm like, yeah, that's hard to hear. But yeah, so how do we resist? How do we continue to resist? So just to give a bit of political context, so the NHS is a government institution. Our government and the British state is not neutral. It never has been neutral. And particularly on Palestine, it's not just an enabler, but it's a partner in this genocide. And as we know, Britain created the state of Israel. So, you know, Israel is an important country for the West, acting as a watchdog state for Western imperial powers in the Middle East. And therefore, Western governments are going to go to any lengths to protect this special relationship with Israel. So for this reason and many others, the NHS is not neutral, no matter what they continue to tell us and make us feel. So there is no doubt that the NHS is a systematically racist institution. So, and I think the only way to challenge this is by using our collective powers as workers and healthcare, you know, people in healthcare, looking at power from the bottom up in mass movements, as opposed to getting a better CEO or team manager or whoever. You know, so to give an example, in the trust that we're in, CNWL, last August, these horrible pogrom, Islamophobic, racist riots broke out in August. And at that time, we were both redeployed. And we had meetings that said, you know, do not attend these riots. You know, counter-protesters were organizing to kind of go and approach these racist rioters. They said, do not attend these. You know, if you attend it, you could face disciplinary action. You know, and they made no differentiation between the racists and the counter-protesters. Does it sound a little bit familiar? So, you know, I even got messages saying, Misa, don't go to these things, you know, don't, you know, but, you know, I'm an anti-racist, so obviously we went. And these counter-protests were huge, and they were a huge success. And last summer, we did defeat the far right, and it was a massive moment. So the next day, who is tweeting about these counter-protesters? None other than our CEO, Claire Murdoch, saying, look at these fantastic, you know, solidarity movements. This is what the NHS is all about, multiculturalism and all of this. And I thought, is that right, Claire? You know, at this moment, well, I'm not allowed in my workplace, and not what you said yesterday. So it's so interesting, isn't it, how we can change the narrative as collective mass movements, and how quickly it can change as well. So how do we create more resistance? I think what me and Zara has done is a good start, is good. I think we refuse to be silent and accept that we're the problem. I think completing internal referrals, appealing those decisions, continuing to email, and also taking legal action is vitally important. And not because I trust in these legal systems or particularly these internal processes. They are rubbish and designed to catch us out. But because I think they've allowed us to bring consciousness to our fellow workers and other healthcare professionals, and raise awareness and bring up the level of class consciousness. So just to change the subject, I had a job interview today. What a day for me, a hell of a day. But I'm thinking, you know, if I'm successful in this job, what my tactics going to be, you know? I want to get myself much more established in my union. And I know Zara spoke about the union bureaucracy, and it is, of course, a thing. And it's not an easy route. We do have to fight even in our unions, because there's a lot of people who want to push us down. But, you know, I think it's really important, because the unions have fought, rank and file people in the unions have fought for Palestine working days of action through the TUC. And those trusts and those things that have done those days of action have been really successful. And even if it seems small, 5 or 6 people holding up a flag, those things are very powerful because they create contradictions in the system. And so I think that we have to organize through the unions. We have to have these arguments through the unions and challenge, union leaders. So we are facing some really scary times at the moment. We have Palestine, we have the rise of the far right. But if we get connected and we get organized, we get active in resistance, we can shape our NHS. It's our NHS. So let's not let CEOs or senior directors or whatever bullshit title they give themselves kind of shape us. They're the genocide deniers and enablers, and we're on the right side of history. Thank you.
We've heard some stories, we've got some background, and now we really want to delve into this, okay? And this is sort of the main theoretical contribution insofar as if we don't understand the repression, where it's coming from, we can't work against it, okay? So every single one of the main themes are titled after what British mental health care likes to see itself as. The first one is that British mental health care likes to see itself as apolitical, right? You'll hear that quite often. We're apolitical. Obviously, from what we've seen, British mental health care is very political. I'm going to start with another story. We'll always be starting with some stories. This is of an Arab mental health professional who, when entering into the NHS, was actually really excited to be part of the NHS because she had noticed that over the years it became, became way more racially and politically conscious. We're talking about Black Lives Matters. We're talking about, people are wearing rainbow lanyards. People are talking about Ukraine. It's become apparent. So she wore a Palestine badge or pin that had the symbol of the raised fist. As you all know, that's often associated with Black Lives Matters as well. But it had the colors of Palestine in it. Okay? Familiar symbol with the colors of Palestine. When she went into the NHS wearing it, one of her managers stopped her and took her aside and started speaking to her about why she's wearing that badge. This was followed by two other people in management who came and spoke to her as well. Suddenly, she's cornered 3 versus 1.
Right.
And this is where the conversation begins. She said, I don't understand why I can't wear this badge because we can wear a Black Lives Matters badge or a Rainbow Alliance badge. To which the person who took her aside initially said, oh, but they're not political movements. Thank you. It is funny. And I was like, yes, they are. They are literally political movements. But this one, because it's in support of Muslim Arabs, is not an acceptable political movement. And she ends, and because our interviews really focus on the embodied experience, she ends by telling me, I'm a pretty calm person, but at that moment I felt blood everywhere, just hot blood. And I remember I left and called my partner crying because it was so unjust. Take a moment just to recall where people are suffering and where they displayed their distress. In the first story, the woman said she ran out, she disassociated, and she had a panic attack outside. This woman said the same thing, right? Think about the emotional labor. Think about directionality here. Where is it safe to express pain? Where is it not?
Mm-hmm.
This theme is very important because you'll notice I'm not starting with racism. I'm starting with politics because it's politics that informs racism, which is why we're talking about racial politics. Okay? The theme is couched in a process that builds upon one another. First of all, erasure. We mentioned erasure. This is why it's so important to begin think of erasure constantly. The erasure we're seeing over there is the same sort of erasure that's happening here. Palestine is too political. The political boundaries, the liberal acceptability disallows Palestine, but allows Zionism. Okay? The political boundaries, imagine goalposts, disallows Palestine inside of it, and therefore it needs to be repressed. It's outside the boundaries of acceptable politics. Because it is repressed, this leads to a climate of violence and threat. It's dangerous to speak up on Palestine because we are outside the boundaries of acceptable politics, and because it is dangerous that people are navigating spaces of violence, they engage in defense strategies while speaking up on Palestine. And the fact that, and we've heard some earlier, and we're going to mention some right now, the fact that people engage in a defense strategy in any way, shape, or form when speaking up on Palestine affirms what? It affirms the violence. Do you understand? You don't need a defense strategy unless you are navigating a climate of violence. We're going to unpack every single one of these. Now, Black Lives Matters and Ukraine came up really often among participants, and I'm only going to be highlighting often just one case story, but please note that it's often reflective of many experiences. Just to say very quickly, and I had to be timing myself, just to let you know, this whole talk is 95% scripted, 5% from the heart. Eventually, the heart supersedes the brain, right? And I'm going to let it run. So just to let you know, I'm going to let myself run a bit. The reason why Black Lives Matters and Ukraine comes up so often, if you sit with it, Black Lives Matters deals with what? It deals with race. Palestine, the erasure of Palestine has to do with what? It also has to do with race. Ukraine has to do with what? Geopolitical conflict. How do liberals frame Palestine? Is also a conflict, quote unquote, right? So it's not an aberration that people are looking at Black Lives Matters and they're looking at Ukraine and noticing something. One white mental health professional, and the abbreviations there are just for me to know who's speaking. I'm trying to do my best to also protect the anonymity and confidentiality of speakers. So some details have changed. I started my psychology training at my university to support activism and engagement with social issues. However, my hopes were not fulfilled. There was some talk, not much action. The Black Lives Matter process brought this issue to the forefront, highlighting the hypocrisy and tokenism. There's this deep sense of hypocrisy and betrayal that comes up. As for Ukraine, initially it said, you may feel strongly about this. It is against our sacred values like compassion. When talking about mobilizing for Palestine, we can't have you talking to patients about political issues. And I said, that's not true. What about Ukraine? People talked about Ukraine so much. She said, Ukraine is totally different. Why is Ukraine different? She said, because in Israel and Palestine, it's thousands of years of religious history. And there's very particular liberal framings of trying to position Palestine outside the boundaries of acceptable politics, right? But we see here the frames not only of it being too political, but the fact that it immediately also then goes into the idea of professionalism. It's not professional. The moment you become too political, you're no longer what? You're no longer professional. You're no longer compassionate. The boundaries of politics is what we need to be focusing on. Why it's not acceptable. Why it's not acceptable to talk about Palestine, which of course, because now you're suddenly, if you have any sense of solidarity for Palestine, you're outside of those boundaries, which leads to a great number, incredible experiences of censorship, censoring others. These are just two of the themes I'm highlighting. People are navigating this. They're saying, I'm definitely worried about anti-Semitism accusations. I haven't received it so far, but observed it. I'm not worried about being accused as I'm being referred to the prevent policy and losing my job in a heartbeat. This idea, this fear of prevent came up really quite often. I'm just saying as a background point. I believe prevent will lead to a really long process where I'm eventually stripped away entirely from my title, and then my family. Who else would support them? It's about me having a job. There's this deep sense of anxiety when you exist outside of the boundaries of acceptable liberal politics. You are navigating a hostile climate, this anxiety of how to speak up on a certain issue, which immediately speaks to what we talk about, the chilling effect, but also people catastrophize, right? They're talking about their fear of losing jobs, etc. But the most important point, and I've mentioned this for a very long time, and anyone who deals with racism and especially racist policies, don't focus on the individual, just focus on relationships. Because the fact that people start censoring others, and there's this racialized consciousness, this fear, in and of itself speaks to a racist climate. One Muslim professional says, I think I've had more than one Muslim colleague say to me, and not in a malicious way, look, you just need to be careful about what you say and what you post on social media, and empathizing with Palestine. There was very much a fear of, we come from a certain background, so you can end up causing trouble for yourself, right? That idea of censoring others is in and of itself one of the most incredible signifiers that we're navigating a racist climate, especially among racialized minorities and within families, and we're going to talk about that too as well. So now we spoke about what? Outside the boundaries of acceptable politics, that renders it a climate of violence, which means that people engage in defense strategies. And the number of defense strategies, I mean, I think I numbered like maybe 10. We're only going to mention 2 here. I'll mention one that came up quite as a surprise for how frequently it came up, and the second for something that's really quite pervasive that we talk about. One of the most fascinating things that came up in my research interviewing people is how many staff members or people who have a sense of solidarity with Palestine would go preemptively to Jewish colleagues to express concern for them. Okay, we're going to talk about the racialization of Jews. In this example, we were umming and ahhing, and this came up previously. We want to be transparent, explain to her we want to talk about Palestine and say it's not anti-Semitic. The colleague was just very angry. She reported us she felt unsafe. In other instances, a colleague brought up Palestine in a reflective space, knowing there's a Jewish colleague there, then felt incredibly distressed for bringing up Palestine, going then afterwards to the Jewish colleague and expressing concern. This comes up quite frequently, and there's an incredible emotional labor here that's being put in, where obviously we're not only concerned in general for how we're perceived, being outside the boundaries of acceptable politics, but for very particular people. And again, I'm mentioning this because we're talking about the racialization of Jews in a very particular way, which I'm going to get to at the second part. But there's also obviously changes in language. People saying, like, there's very pedantic language around when we talk about Palestine. It's never, don't be aggressive or inappropriate. Always before I open my mouth or say anything, I spend a lot of time and energy really going through it in my head. So thinking also about the emotional labor and the cognitive labor, right? Always thinking 3, 4, 5 times, what am I about to say? We think about language of condemnation. Many participants wouldn't start a conversation about Palestine before condemning Hamas. By the way, FYI, we wrote a book called I Refuse to Condemn. You can check that out. The very politics of condemnation speaks to a racist climate in and of itself, right? But I want you just to hold on to these quotes, because think about the emotional and cognitive labor that's being invested here. Having to constantly think for yourself over and over again, how do I speak about this? How do I share my thoughts about Palestine? Now that we've pointed out to sorry, I should always take a moment to now that we set up the fact that British mental health care is actually quite political in what it allows in and what it disallows. We're going to address the point that it obviously sees itself as anti-racist and maybe at worst not racist at all, not really caring, right? But it is incredibly racist. And I think we can already see the themes, but I think we need to theorize and understand it a little bit more. So I'm going to start with an example of a Muslim psychologist working in a mental health trust that primarily, or service that primarily deals with Muslims. We had a young Muslim group of service users, and when the genocide happened, they said, we want to do a bake sale because a few of them could bake cakes. They wanted to do a little event and raise money for Palestine. We're trying to get them to do events and things like this, get their confidence built. They were met by the person who was facilitating the service. I'm sorry, but we cannot align ourselves with. And she started talking about extremism and Hamas. And then said, if you raise money for Palestinian children, you must share it with Israeli children as well. We cannot be seen siding with one and not the other. So I'm going to take a moment. I'm already holding myself, and I'll tell you why. And that when the word Hamas is brought up and terrorism is brought up to a racialized Muslim, it's not an immaterial statement. It's a statement that is pregnant with incredible, violent threat. Because terrorism and Hamas, supporting them is a criminal offense. Counterterrorism exists outside the boundaries of rights, right? It's about taking away people's rights. That's the whole idea of counterterrorism framework. If you listen to this, don't just listen to it. You have to understand that there's a woman here threatening Muslim youth with a counterterrorism legislation, which is one of the most incredibly violent things you can actually do to anyone, really, in a racialized Muslim community. I find it very difficult, and I think I clench sometimes because I've been talking about this for years. I find it very difficult to explain how embodied of an experience this is. So we're going to take a moment just to think about Islamophobia in Palestine and the racialization of Muslims in particular. One Muslim mental health professional says, living in the UK as a Pakistani Muslim woman, racism kind of happens quite a bit. I've experienced it. I've been told to go back where I've come from. I've been asked if there's a bomb in my college bag that I was carrying once when I was going on my way to the exam. Okay? Here is what the element of securitization. What are Muslims racialized to? Remember, I spoke about racialization, so you all have to stay with me. I know it's pretty late. Muslims are racialized to security threat, right? According to Space and Time, this is really, really important. Another Muslim mental health professional talks about you can't work in mental health and social care and not compartmentalize. Otherwise, you literally last in the job for about 6 months. I've dealt with Islamophobia from people I work with, clients, colleagues. It's for the most part invisible. I'm good at keeping the anger in and frustration at sadness. I don't let it seep out really. And I felt like work isn't politically safe for me to talk about these issues because it's so divisive. So people are embodied. They carry this history of knowing what it is to be racialized in a very particular way, which is, of course, the same things that, for example, Michelle Alexander talks about in the New Jim Crow, Black youth, being racialized to what, to gangs, right? And then their embodied experience of being around police officers, for example. We're talking about histories of racism, of compartmentalizing, of feeling unsafe that people are carrying day in and day out within structures that legitimize it, specifically counterterrorism policies. And I've affirmed already from the beginning that one of the main proponents, not the central proponent, but one of the main proponents of counterterrorism policies here in the UK is our Zionist groups, right? So how do we make sense of, and this comes up quite often, this has been something that's been posed to me for many years, right? I say counterterrorism is racist. I get 20 hands coming to me afterwards. How can it be racist if it's catching white people? Right? I say prevent is racist. How can it be racist if it's catching white people? Okay. Now, I'm going to make a very simple point. Just because white people are caught in a racist policy does not make that policy unracist. Okay? It just means there's different thresholds to what allows somebody into a racist policy. That their bodies alone may not be sufficient to be captured within it, but they can still be captured. However, when it comes here to this topic, there's something else very, very important for us to understand. That it's not only Muslims that are being racialized through security policies, and that they have a history of this. So Muslims can be captured within frameworks associated with terrorism, but also that Zionism also racializes Jews to need to be protected, right, as particularly psychologically vulnerable to anything around genocide, anything around that might offend them per relationship to Israel in specific, right? And that explains why a racialized Muslim can be captured within the security logic for themselves. They can also be accused of anti-Semitism for the racialization of Jews. Do you understand? And that's why in the Venn diagram, this might not be a great Venn diagram. I'm happy to get some feedback. But I'm trying to explain in this green part here, which would be like an inverted moon, how certainly a white person, not because of how they are racialized, but because of how their Jewish colleague or Jewish patients, or how that group is being racialized as particularly in need of safety, that they can be impacted. Now, impacted or accused of anti-Semitism. So we are trying to theorize and make sense of all the different ways that racialization operates here. But there's a very important point, and having discussed this idea with several people, it also, just as a side note, sometimes raised within movements why it's so interesting if you look at some movements that obviously support direct action, why there's generally less Muslims there, right? There's generally less Muslims, and this is a long-standing point that's well understood actually, but not really clearly articulated. So this Venn diagram explains it. The reason why racialized Muslims generally don't put themselves generally at the forefront of things that will get them associated with security is because they have a living embodied history and experience of fear of it. Do you understand? This living embodied experience is what's preventing many people from speaking up, from doing direct action, because they know their histories. They have parents, they have family, they have everyone telling them, you are going to be securitized. I mean, hell, I remember when I was 16 and I'm traveling, my friend, his white mom came up to me and she's like, Tarek, you got to shave your beard, please, before you travel. I'm afraid for you, right? I mean, this is the sort of thing that we grew up with. We live with this. It speaks to many different dynamics that I'm really pinpointing here. But now let's delve into it. Okay. So obviously prevent. People spoke about actual instances whereby a patient was going on demonstrations and was reported to prevent. And again, prevent has wider dynamics, but the fact that someone had gone into a demonstration feeds into the prevent process. And to be very clear for anyone listening in, for years, we've been saying that Palestine has been a central issue in the logic of prevent. And I know of many people who've been referred to prevent prior to October 7th for their sharing of solidarity on Palestine. But if you look at also the idea, the way it's associated with counterterrorism, responding to the... So this is a very important story, actually. I'll give it its due. One Muslim mental health professional was telling me how the trust where she works, leadership sent out an email following October 7th that was very pro-Israeli. Now, I think anyone who's been working in a public mental health institution probably received that same email in some way, shape, or form. She replied back to that email. Then that same leadership sent an email saying, hey, be careful not to support Hamas. Something in that spirit. Really stating Hamas very clearly. And then she says, and responding to the Hamas email, remember she responded to the first email from leadership warning not to support Hamas, would have definitely been a reason for them to kick me off the course or refer me to prevent. I felt in terms of risk, the first email expressing concern for Israel felt risky to respond to, but the Hamas email we got felt riskier to respond to. I decided to not take that risk. I didn't reply to that one. Okay. I'm talking about the material functional violence that is brought up when we bring in Hamas, the chilling effect, the climate of risk, and we can keep going. One Muslim mental health professional says about a situation at her service, a white woman turned around to a Muslim colleague and said, "How dare you say that? Do you support Hamas?" And accused her of supporting Hamas in the office. So I just had this paranoia the whole time. What are these people thinking of me? And it does play into all these tropes, I think, of Muslims being terrorists, right? Think of the liberty of the way Hamas and terrorism is being employed. Again, I cannot articulate enough that this is an incredibly violent thing to do. It is a violent thing to do, not only because of people's racialized histories, but because of the incredible power of the state that it carries behind it. To accuse someone of Hamas is to literally destroy their lives. Another example, when the male clinical psychologist Arab raised Palestine, the fact the service didn't talk about Gaza, the Zionists in the meeting cried and stuff and said, "You can't. What's happening in Israel is so bad, and it means you're sympathizing with Hamas." And that's what got fed to me. So there's material legal threat. There's incredible paranoia, and I think the idea of paranoia came up before. It's hard to also, unless you're a racialized Muslim and you understand how to navigate counterterrorism legislation, as I'm doing right now, even speaking out. This is in vivo right here, right? We're talking about this. I can feel it. Sometimes I'm clenching. I got to remember, okay, well, it is what it is, But this is actually the material threat. There's a material threat, counterterrorism, again, existing in a state of exceptionality. And that paranoia and shock cannot be understated when knowing that this is how people are allowed to speak. And we're talking about now the liberal acceptability afforded to Zionist logics and narrative is incredible. But then there's the racialization of Jews. And of course, I think there's something here that I need to emphasize, because this is a Zionist narrative, right? There's also a very clear erasure of anti-Zionist Jews. And I've been speaking with so many who are deeply impacted, actually, by their erasure. But insofar as the Zionist narrative allows, when I called it a genocide, one mental health professional was saying, one of the Israeli women said to me, "You're not allowed to use that word." You're offended I use that word? It was like she was saying, our community is allowed to use it, yours isn't. Another white mental health professional told me, "I've been told you cannot use the word genocide. This term equates to anti-Semitism. I could be charged, and the consequences of having a criminal conviction would mean losing my professional registration, losing my employment." So obviously the genocide is being actively erased. But what I'm trying to also point out here actually leads to the second slide, right? Which has to do with psychological safety. And this actually came up really quite repeatedly in my interviews. talking about Palestine, for example, one lead would say, "Oh, imagine how someone who's Jewish who comes into service for you, how would they feel if they saw somebody wearing the Palestine pin?" Another said it was a vigil for healthcare workers. I got this email from my service manager, really patronizing, saying like, "It's so lovely that you're so empathic, but we can't allow this to take place in the workplace because our buildings need to be inclusive place for all."
Yeah.
And then another also mentioned that them talking or rallying around Palestine is not bullying, it's indirect bullying, right? So there's a lot here around that's being mobilized around the psychological safety of Jews, but this is the institution racializing this. Now, I want to make a very important point here. One thing that really struck me that I hadn't noticed just doing individual interviews, but sitting with all of them, is how much white institutions and leadership are racializing Jewish colleagues and service users to be particularly psychologically vulnerable and therefore require exceptional treatment around discussions of genocide. When we say that Zionism is actually the greatest form of anti-Semitism, you're having empirical proof right here in front of you of how that's occurring, right? They're exceptionalizing. It's coming from the institutions and white leadership themselves who are saying, "Hey, don't mention genocide around this staff member, around that service user." When they know that the global majority are calling it a genocide, they are exceptionalizing their Jewish colleagues. They are exceptionalizing their Jewish service users. So think about how Zionism actually affirms anti-Semitism insofar as that exceptionalizes Jewish colleagues and patients. But that's exactly part of the Zionist narrative in particular, right? And so I think we have to hold on to actually what the liberal acceptability of Zionism is actually doing, not in protecting Jewish patients and colleagues, but actually exceptionally racializing them. Do you understand what I'm saying here? This is really, really important because this is something that, is the other side of the coin, obviously, when it comes to the racialization of Muslims. Now, clearly then, British mental health care, we've been talking about a lot of violence, so I don't have to really delve into it too much. It says it's a safe space, right? We hear this word constantly, safe. It's not safe. This story really hit me. And it's just one of many. This is a Palestinian therapist. Okay? I'll read it from the beginning. I'm in a seminar I paid money for. 2 Zionists were speaking for 40 minutes talking about Israel following October 7th. One of the Israelis says something about terrorists. Not even animals behave like that. No reaction from anyone. I felt like I really can't say anything, and they persisted to bring this topic to the group. So yeah. One day my mom contacted me. They killed my dad's cousins, 2 little girls, because her dad's family is from Gaza. It affected me. We've got the same surname. I started to share with the group, actually, we've had 2 deaths in the family, 2 little girls. And that's when the 2 Israelis started verbally attacking me. So sorry this has happened. But why didn't they get out of the house? Because the military warns people, we don't actively kill people. One of them said to me, I don't understand why Palestinians live there. There's so many other Arab countries. So she was expressing a view in favor of ethnic cleansing. After I shared what happened in my family, she said, there's this many hostages from my town, and she didn't know a single one of them. I think it, as in sharing my experience, just completely derailed these 2 women. They just went on the attack. It got so bad. There's a lot of ways of speaking about how British mental health care is not safe. we're going to just quickly go over it in 3 categories. That is not safe for Palestinians in particular. It's not safe for professionals and trainees, and it's not safe for service users. The reason why I want to emphasize Palestinians, and maybe I'll give an explanation after, that I find is really relevant to the process of racialization. One professional says, we had a refugee family from Palestine. How could we not be thinking about their care in this current climate outside of just our team's work? We were talking about them struggling to engage. So this family was struggling to engage because the service wouldn't recognize what it meant to be Palestinian in this time of genocide. One Palestinian colleague spoke to a service user and said, hey, have you got a few minutes? So the person, not service user, to the professional, it was a white professional that I was speaking with. And she was telling me the story, have you got a few minutes? So we went to a side room, and even though the door was closed, the fear was so much, we still spoke in hushed tones. We were whispering to each other, and it turned out he's Palestinian. He told me he'd been detained without charge for 2 years in an Israeli prison. Right? These are our colleagues working in this climate of violence. One mental health professional who's an Arab, but who has family in Palestine, in Gaza, says, I feel so personally demonized in a country where you devoted so much of your life to support, to help them overcome some of their horrible experiences they've gone through. And then I'm also having to deal with the fact that there are instances that I absolutely cannot speak about. One of them is that I personally lost 25 members of my family. Even among racialized Muslims, we know there's Muslim Zionists, by the way. To be very clear, when I say Zionists, they can be anybody. A racialized Muslim can hide, right? People make fun of DJ Khaled and stuff like that, right? People can hide to an extent. Actually, with DJ Khaled, that's the exception because it sticks out. But, a racialized Muslim would be like, I'm not going to talk about Palestine whatsoever. And then remain within the boundaries of liberal acceptability. Remember, liberal racism, foxes and wolves, they can be like, okay, I'm going to condemn Hamas, I'm going to condemn terrorism, I'm going to do all this. They can play that. A Palestinian, their very existence, do you understand? Their bodies themselves are exactly the focal point of erasure as well. They can't hide. They can't hide the fact that they lose family. I didn't lose family in Gaza. I can still be obviously racialized and securitized within a counterterrorism framework. I can be accused of anti-Semitism because of infringing on the psychological safety of Jewish colleagues. But my body is not necessarily exactly the point of erasure, because in the whole point of a settler colonial process, it's what? It's erasure. And I think this is something that we're not fully capturing in terms of the violence of how much they're struggling. Palestinians in our spaces of healing, how much fear they have. He's talking about hushed tones, closing a door and saying, I was in prison for 2 years, and he has to say that behind hushed doors. And then the amount of grief that's not being acknowledged. This is all being hidden underneath the carpet. Because why? Because the liberal acceptability of Zionism within our healthcare institutions won't allow them to surface. As we saw in the first example, the moment that Palestinian brought up that she had lost 2 of her cousins, what happened to her? She got attacked. It's not safe for service users. I think for the sake of time, a lot of this has kind of been detailed. So, there's one case story, there's actually several case stories, I just put them up, about how services are not recognizing the impact that the genocide is having on especially racialized Muslims, but not only them, for everyone, bearing witness to a genocide, that it might affect people's meal plans. They're also being pathologized, right? So there's a process of medicalization that we know very well. Insofar as that, in this case, a Palestinian teenager couldn't concentrate on her exams and was referred to a mental health service whereby 100 members of her family had been killed, irrespective of what the service then does at the end. That's irrelevant. The fact that there's a process of medicalization, and this is not the only example. There's the fact that there's services in the UK that primarily service Muslim demographics. And one Muslim professional was telling me Muslims make the majority of clients and patients in these mental health settings. Liberal Zionists who work in these settings had very particular concerns with these youth expressing sympathies and support for Palestine. I mean, we're talking about a mental health trust that's allowing liberal Zionists. Now, remember, what's the difference between illiberal and liberal Zionism? I'm gonna quiz you guys on this. An illiberal Zionist would say what? Get rid of all Palestinians. They speak like that. We often hear it in Israel proper. A liberal Zionist is not saying I hate all Palestinians. In fact, liberal racists often work in places of diversity, right? Which is why, actually, several occasions, and I'm going to be writing about this, there were liberal Zionists in our anti-racist reflective spaces. There were liberal Zionists in our EDI spaces, equality, diversity, and inclusion. One of my clients did a fundraiser in the middle of last year. She spoke about it in the therapy that she was quite censored with how she advertised about this fundraiser. She was told to remove watermelons. Another is, a girl, a service user I work with, she was told she had to remove her Palestine badge in school. So those conversations were happening. They're really helpful for me. It felt like similar things I was going through. I'm going through this just to highlight that so many people are experiencing these things. And our services are not at all safe for them to bring this up. Obviously, for professionals, there's a deep sense of betrayal, hypocrisy, and hopelessness for many of you. Here with this quote, in the NHS, I had this idea that people are more switched on. We were working with diverse circles. Things are changing for the better. I see people are passionate about health inequalities. They're talking about racism. And then everything came crashing down. I'm going to just end really quick. We spoke about some very difficult experiences here today. One thing we need to always be mindful of is that the form and function of this sort of violence is to destabilize us, to make us feel helpless and hopeless, right? Which is the whole point of Healing Justice London. That's why we call it movement medicine, is that we need to resource ourselves and remain resourced and be cognizant of how we feel as we're navigating climates of violence and marginalization. So to end, I wanted just to remind everyone, our communities are resourcing. We found really fantastic inspirational quotes from that before. You could certainly go to HJL website to learn more about what we do. I've recently launched, I say recently, a couple of years ago, Coming Home project for people who've been securitized and criminalized, for them to receive support that is actually desecuritized, as politically conscious. There's also organizations like Cage that support people. So if anyone here is going through an issue, you can reach out to Cage if you have any issues with your work. I'm going to end on a couple of points really quick. Some take-homes. The report, by the way, is coming out in September, hopefully, inshallah. And obviously, there's a lot of things we could talk about with this sort of work, what we want, what we need, based on having a very theoretically informed understanding of the racism, right? We're developing theories so that informs what we need to develop as alternatives. But I just wanted to mention at least 3 points about theory and practice. One of the things I'm really trying to highlight is that it's not enough to be pro-Palestinian, okay? Just as it is, if you are supportive of the issues impacting the Black community, it's not just enough to be supportive of the Black community. You need to understand that Black youth are far more likely to be stop and search by racist stop and search policies through policing practices, right? You have to be standing against policing to understand the violence and to protect our Black youth, right? If you're supportive of the Muslim community, to just simply say, I support Muslims, is not the only point. It's to also be against Schedule 7 arrests, which are much more likely. 95% of all Schedule 7, that's border policing arrests, are more likely to happen to Muslims. Counterterrorism policies. And similarly, if we're talking about being pro-Palestinian, we have to understand where the violence is coming from. It's not simply enough to be pro-Palestinian. Well, what the whole point of what I've been recognizing here is that we have to understand where their erasure is coming from. And that is the fact that it's Zionist logics and narratives, the liberal acceptability afforded to Zionism in spaces of healing, that is the cause of violence towards Palestinians. We have to be against that explicitly. And maybe I'll just end on a point that we need to really go, any discussions around anti-racism that's not focused on, that's politically informed, that's against repression, is empty. I'm just going to end it there. There's obviously a lot more I can talk about, which you can see, but we'll just leave it for discussion.